Hello, thank you for joining us online at UNU here in Tokyo, the headquarters of the university. A reminder that we have many institutes on the continents around the world, all 5 principal ones and programs elsewhere, and that in Japan we have an institute, an in-house think tank called the Center for Policy Research, the institutional headquarters of UNU, but that actually were a small part of the UNU family. However, we're very lucky because we get wonderful guests in Tokyo. And tonight we have with us Sir Adam Roberts. He's a great historian. He taught politics for many years, particularly the international relations dimension of politics. And he also has written very impressively on the laws of war, and many other subjects. So he extends across several disciplines. He was an activist in his youth against nuclear weapons and in favor of nuclear disarmament. He's a man of many parts. For 21 years, he was the Montagu Burton Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. Before that, he was at the London School of Economics. And after Oxford, he went on to be the president of the British Academy, one of the most famous, one of the proudest institutions of Great Britain. But he was knighted in 1992, or 2002, I should say, for his extraordinary scholarly output long before he went to the British Academy. He's going to be speaking this evening at UNU about 1914 and 2014, the resemblances, but also the differences. So we thought for those of you online, you might enjoy a bit of a preview of what he may be saying later on. And so, Adam, may we start and talk a bit about 1914. What was particular then? What brought about the conflict? And a bit later in our conversation, we'll get to what's different today.
Well, I'm certainly impressed by what was particular about the beginnings of that conflict. I was actually in Sarajevo on the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the shooting of the Archduke Ferdinand that started the whole war going. And you can't but be struck by the thought, when you see the wrong turning that the car with the Archduke took up a very narrow street, that the whole course of 20th century history might have been quite different if the chauffeur had not made the mistake of going up that street, which was not where he was supposed to go. And it might have been quite different if the car had had a reverse gear. Astonishingly, it didn't. And so there's an element of chance, it seems to me, in the beginning of the war, which is one crucial factor that one should not neglect. I don't think the war was inevitable. But also, one has to accept, and indeed it's a very important conclusion, that great disasters always have multiple causes. It takes a lot of things to go wrong to produce a great disaster. And there were certainly multiple causes involved in 1914. There was the general belief in social Darwinism, the idea that mankind proves his superiority and nations, individual nations, prove their superiority but through struggle and only through struggle. And that was coupled with a belief that states had to demonstrate their greatness by acquiring empires, which was fine for Britain and France, which had empires, but there were others who did not, like Germany, that were anxious to acquire them. So that was a source of friction. And then, of course, there was the uncertainty of a collapsing empire, the Habsburg Empire, which had a very uncertain hold over Bosnia and Herzegovina, and wanted to show we're tough. And so they started an anti-terrorist war. They twice mentioned terrorism as the reason for going to war. And it's often forgotten. And in the commemorations of 1914, it's been almost entirely forgotten that the war started as an anti-terrorist war. And it's also been conveniently forgotten that the Brits were on the same side as the terrorist. Gavril Princip had come from Serbia. He'd been given his weapons, apparently by the Serbian army. And Britain was fighting on the same war then as terrorists. But nobody wants to refer to that in remembering the war.
Interesting. And of course, the terrorism is a huge link to the world today and its struggle and obsession, indeed, with terrorism. I wonder also about individual people, the luck of who happens to be in power at any given time when a global situation could lend itself to a conflagration.
There really is an issue there. Some of the characters involved were just the wrong people to be in the particular job they were in at the time, at least as far as the stability of Europe was concerned. The German Kaiser was rather belligerent. The British Foreign Secretary, who was a former student of my college at Oxford, Balliol College, was rather lazy. He didn't bother to travel at all. And he certainly was not the person to give a message in right time that Britain really intended to defend Belgium. He did it rather too late. And so among the causes of the war was a bit of a failure of deterrence, if you like, that Britain had failed to make it sufficiently clear to Germany that it would fight over Belgium. But the most ironic, as it were, personal issue, it seems to me, in the beginning of the war, is the curious way in which, I think unknowingly, Gavril Princip killed the strongest advocate of peace in Vienna, namely the Archduke Ferdinand, who was going to succeed to the throne. And therefore, the war owed something to the irony that he was taken out of the equation.
Now, before we jump ahead to 2014, I wanted to ask you how the end of the First World War changed the world, introduced a new international system, or didn't.
Well, it was certainly aimed to, and the war rhetoric of this is a war to end war had then led naturally to there being tremendous attention on the peace conference at the end of the war. Because if this was the war to end war, then there had to be a very impressive peace. And Woodrow Wilson came from the United States and was regarded by many initially as a savior who would bring peace to Europe. And the doctrine of self-determination, national self-determination, was proclaimed to be a foundation for the peace. And as so often happens in politics, when there are really ambitious claims made and optimistic statements are made about the future, the letdown was terrible. And the letdown included the disastrous, tough provisions on Germany, which, as we all now know, contributed something to the rise of Hitlerism. But also there were other disasters that have been somewhat less publicized, such as the effect on the Far East. China, feeling that the Versailles Agreement had left Japan in control of some of the concessions there, and therefore denied them what they considered to be their rights, having, apart from anything else, supplied many troops to take part in the Allied cause in the First World War. So that it left a justifiable sense of grievance in China. And there were grievances elsewhere. In fact, the Japanese themselves felt that the Allied powers didn't understand their concerns, didn't accept their proposal for a racial equality clause. So there was grievance all round. And I think it's ironic but necessary to compare the outcome of World War I in terms of a peace agreement with World War II. We didn't have a peace agreement at the end of World War II, and it was much more satisfactory in the end than the peace agreement which we had with all that fanfare after World War I, and probably led to fewer problems. The other, of course, big decision in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference was to set up the League of Nations, to have a new international organization to achieve a degree of collective action and peace that had eluded states before then. And maybe it was inevitable that the first attempt at an organization would be faulty. People do learn by their mistakes eventually. And we all know the League of Nations was not successful. In retrospect, it's obvious that some of the clauses were stupid in the League of Nations covenant. But in the end, we've all been part of a learning process, and maybe some better lessons were learned after World War II.
Now, coming forward to 2014, we have a different set of international organizations, probably a better UN Charter, but also completely different circumstances in the world today. And I wanted to ask you whether some of these circumstances may make a repeat of World War I less likely.
Well, there are some circumstances that are similar. There's still some quite worrying competitive nationalism around in the world, including, for example, one sees in China's claims to islands in the South China Sea or in between China and Japan. There are worries there. There's the worry of the continued way in which terrorism today, as in 1914, can contribute to the initiation of wars. There are many other similarities, including that worrying sense that some powers are rising and others declining, and in either case, they may want to resist the trend by showing how tough they are. The similarities are enough to be worrying, but there are some fundamental differences as well. One is that international war has declined dramatically in the past 60 or 70 years, quite dramatically, so that there are fewer international wars than there used to be. And one can argue about the many, many reasons for that, but the fact is in itself pretty solid. It's not a guarantee that it will continue, but it is there. And then there are other differences too, and one of them is not only do states all belong to an international organization which still endures, the United Nations, for all its faults, and there are many, as we all know, but also states feel the need to operate collectively on a wider range than just at the UN. For example, it's very, very striking that in Europe, since the Soviet Union ceased to exist, many thought that NATO would cease to exist. And quite reasonably so. NATO had been formed because of a worry about the Soviet Union in 1949. But actually, not a single political party of any consequence among all the numerous NATO members has proposed getting out of NATO or ending the NATO treaty. It's quite extraordinary. And I think the reason is that states have got used to acting collectively in security matters. They found it valuable, and although it does impose constraints of various kinds, and they don't want to change that. And I think that that collective approach to security has probably been a factor making for stability even in some of the difficult crises that Europe has had, including, for example, over Ukraine.
We hear outside, by the way, demonstrators who are on the plaza in front of UNU, being the largest UN building in Tokyo, demonstrating about the plight of Kurdish populations in their homelands today. And we're reminded that while world war may not be likely or imminent, there's plenty of conflict in the world today, in spite of the international organizations we have. So in that sense, Wilsonian thought was to a degree utopian, and it seems to me swept away in convenient realities in many ways.
Absolutely. It is remarkable that virtually all the conflicts in the world since 1945 have been conflicts which you might describe as post-colonial.
Yes.
That's to say, when a colonial power withdraws or an empire breaks up, it is very difficult by nature for a successor state to establish boundaries with which it is comfortable, to establish a constitutional system that works, to work out relations with neighbours, to work out relations between the peoples within the given state concerned. All of these are extremely difficult tasks. And it's not just a question of colonies in Africa or far away from the mother country. For example, in the United Kingdom, the problem of Northern Ireland is, in essence, another post-colonial problem. It's a remnant of English and Scottish colonisation of Ireland and what happened when we withdrew from the Republic of Ireland. You're left with a minority population that doesn't trust the majority in Northern Ireland, and unhappiness about the borders with which they've been suddenly saddled. It's an absolutely classic post-colonial problem. And that seems to be the pattern of conflict today. It's not entirely new, of course. And indeed, one could regard part of the problem of Bosnia that started World War I as being, in a sense, post-colonial. It's the stirring of nationalism. But what is undoubtedly true is that, as you hinted, Woodrow Wilson's doctrine of national self-determination has proved unsatisfactory and disruptive. And of course, the criticism that was always made of Woodrow Wilson was that he didn't actually bother about the details.
Exactly.
And whatever subject you're looking at, in politics or international relations, the devil is always there in the detail. And it certainly was in this particular case of nationalities and national self-determination.
Well, one line running through our conversation so far this evening has been nationalism. It is with us. It was with us. Adam, thank you very much for being online this evening as well as live in a little while in Tokyo. It's a fascinating topic. There have been a number of very good books about 1914 this year. And it's a topic, I think, that fascinates countries from Japan to Latin America and that we haven't finished discussing. Many thanks for coming to Tokyo.